Today we're going to be making scatter terrain to fill in a gap that I think we have in a lot of tabletop gaming. Vegetable patches. There's always a lot of plants, but nothing that our minis could eat. And that's pretty important. Hi, I'm Seb and I make stuff. So a few weeks ago, you guys may have seen the video where I made these raised garden beds. These were all about flowers and adding something pretty to the build. And today we're going to be making a slight variation of those, taking that down to a much thinner, closer to the ground level, and building out some veggie patches. So you can have some scatter terrain for your farms and villages, or really any circumstance that you want to have something a little bit more edible on the table. This is a super cheap build using some really basic materials like matchsticks and coffee stir sticks in combination with some foam board and a few different paints and texture pastes. Then we're going to try and make some variety by making our own plants and vegetables and not just some static grass and flowers. So let's jump into the build. I use this foam board in a lot of my builds and I actually get a lot of questions about it. Basically, it's just a 5mm thick foam board, but it doesn't come ready to use. I buy this in packs of 5, and obviously depending on the different places you can buy from, the quality varies a lot. It comes with a paper layer stuck over the whole thing. So every time you want to build with this, ideally, you want to be peeling this paper off first. That way it reveals the foam and this stuff takes detailed carving really nicely. So, a lot of these cheaper ones won't tear off as nicely. Something I have seen people do is soak it with a little bit of water or isopropyl alcohol, because that tends to help break the glue up underneath. So once we have that off, this piece is ready to go. It's a super handy piece of material and I'm going to continue using it a lot in the future. Once we have that ready, we throw it down on a cutting surface and grab out a Stanley knife. We just really need a sharp blade for this, and you can make it in any shape you want. Our first one is going to be a 2 by 3 inch.
I cut out a handful of these, sticking to the 2 by 2 and 2 by 3 inch sections. Then grabbing out some wooden toothpicks and coffee stir sticks, chopping these down to size to fit around our edges to hold our garden beds in place. I'm going to hot glue these down and they fit perfectly along the edges of our foam board. Once we have the edges in place, I'm going to put some little corner spokes in with some of those toothpicks and chop them all down to size. Now we're grabbing out the Tamiya soil effects. You don't need this, you could probably just paint the bottom brown, but I love the dry dirt texture that this gives. Quickly, I realized that I should be doing this before I glue all the edges down, so for the rest of these, that was the approach. Once I had done all the textures and glued all those wooden pieces around the edges, I came around with a little bit of super glue just to give it a little bit more support on those edge pieces before trimming the rest of them down to size. Now it's time to stain up all of that exterior wood. You could keep it in this original color if you wanted, but I wanted it to look nice and dirty. So I stained it all using an Agrax Earthshade, giving me a nice dark wooden color.
Now that we have our bases done, the dirt has dried, we have a nice basic brown around the edge, it's time to start adding in our fruit and veggies that will be growing in our veggie patches. For this, I'm going to try 3D printing some bits, making some bits from scratch, but also using some of these awesome bits and pieces that I got from the Modular's Warehouse, which is a website here in Australia that deliver all over the world, and they have some brilliant little miniature fruits, veggies, and other bits and pieces that can fill in these gaps nicely. So we'll do a couple of pieces using their pre-bought bits, some with 3D prints, and a handful of completely original pieces that I'm going to be building from scratch for any of you out there who don't have 3D printers and don't want to go out and buy something. So let's see how I go with those and start building out and planting out our veggie patches. So the first one I'm going to try will be this guy right here, and we're going to turn that into a pumpkin patch.
I picked these ones up from Modular's Warehouse just before they shut down their actual store, and this is actually what inspired this entire build. So we're going to pull these out and just push them into the foam, maybe glue them in place as we finalize where we want them, and that's a pumpkin patch ready to go.
Now the pumpkin patch has come out looking really nice, but we want to make some more of these that don't involve you having to go out and buy these elements. So next up, we're going to be using some clump foliage, matchsticks, and a couple of twigs from the backyard to make some grapevines. As you've probably seen if you've ever gone past a vineyard, grapevines are planted out along large trellis systems. So we're going to be taking these matchsticks, cutting them down to size and staining them with some Agrax Earthshade to make our base.
Once again, you probably don't have to stain them, but I want these to look dark and dirty and like they've been there forever. So we paint a heap of these up because they're going to come in handy again later and start cutting them down to about half of the original size. I'm pushing these straight down into our foam base piece in equal distances between them and then grabbing out some thread. This is going to work as our trellis system. So I tie on and glue it down to the first piece, wrap it back and forth and use a little bit of super glue to hold that all in place. I repeat this on the other side and get us a nice base trellis. You could do multiple layers of these, but most of this is going to be hidden anyway, so this will do for now. Then I'm taking out those twigs that I pulled out of the garden, cutting them down to size, and pushing them down into our foam along our trellis system, filling in those gaps. Now that's looking good. We repeat this on the other side, filling in all of our gaps, then coming in with a little bit of super glue to just make sure that everything stays in place. I hit this with an accelerant to speed up the drying so we can move on to the next stage of adding foliage. For this, I'm using clump foliage. Basically just grabbing a big chunk of it, covering the tops of our sticks in super glue and pressing it in place. Working my way around all of our vines, filling in any of the gaps and trying to build out a nice, luscious, full plant top that will represent our grapevines. Now to add something a little bit extra, I used a little bit of wood glue and this Notch Scenics dead leaves effect that I've got and added a big bead of glue along the base of where our plants are growing and coated the entire thing in that whatever this is from Notch Scenics. I don't really know exactly what it's meant for, but I like the idea that it's kind of a barky base to be put around the bottom of the plants to help promote the growth.
Now I am stoked with how these grapevines came out. You could do a much longer series of these or a whole heap of them and lay them out differently to really build out a full vineyard, but for now, one little batch of these is going to work nicely for my purposes. After seeing how well this one has worked out, I'm going to now try my hand at making some different kind of trellises with other plants. So maybe some tomatoes and some beans. The first plant we're going to do is some beans, and as a gardener myself, I know that these grow best on trellises. So we're going to grab out some more of those sticks we used earlier and cut them down even smaller into quarters long ways this time. Restain up these open sections and start gluing these together into a small teepee design, which is going to work as our trellis. Now to add the bean vines, we're going to be using these green climbing vines that I got from Modular's warehouse. Tear a little section of those off and just start wrapping them and gluing them inside of our trellis. I'm pretty stoked with how this looks, so we're going to repeat that, making a whole heap more trellises and just filling them all up with that vine. This is very finicky work and it's going to take a while, but we'll skip over the process of building the whole lot and show you the final result once we got to glue a full batch of these down, completely filling out this garden bed with trellises and beans. Now that we have a beautiful collection of beans growing up into their trellises, it's time for the next most common plant that we can think of, which is tomatoes. Tomatoes grow up stakes, so we're going to use some of those same chopped down pieces we used for the trellises and add a little dollop of super glue to help hold them in place. Here is a real-time video showing how quick that accelerant works to get that superglue dry and ready to move on. For the tomato bushes, I'm going to be using this random fake moss stuff from Amazon. It's basically just a heap of messed up green twine, but hey, it's going to do the trick for what we need here. So we glue down some sticks to work as our base stalks, and then just glue a heap of that weird fake moss stuff from Amazon onto each of them. This is going to do the trick as our main foliage, but we need fruits. So I've got these little guys here from Modular's warehouse, and I'm going to be using some dollops of wood glue, just kind of randomly smattering them all over the foliage, then picking up all of those tiny little balls and slowly putting them in place around our plants. Once again, this is some small finicky details,
Maybe not completely necessary, but I love doing this stuff. So I just threw on a podcast, chilled out, and spent a good amount of time adding tiny little fruits to these trees, and then left them to dry.
Now, as the avid gardener that I am, I have actually grown tomatoes in the past, and something I learned is a lot of people like to plant marigolds in strips along their tomatoes. Some people believe it makes them taste better, but the real reason is that they are what's referred to as a sacrificial plant, which tends to draw in all the pests and stop them from destroying your fruiting plants. You probably don't need to know that, but that's the reason I'm going to be adding some flowers in along my tomatoes right here.
That should hopefully keep them pest-free.
So I did a first batch of 3D printing, and honestly, I kind of stuffed up the scale of these. They are far too big for our purposes unless we want cabbages that are twice the size of a human. And these corn stalks, while they look beautiful, are way too big. They might look great when I have them all lined up, but this stuff breaks really easily, and it would really annoy me if I went to all the effort to paint these up, get them built, put them all in place, and then just have them all snap off. So as an alternative, I'm going to try and make some of these from scratch with a bit more durable materials that you at home can actually get access to, so you can make them yourself even without a 3D printer.
So we start with paper and some toothpicks. Then I'm going to grab out some alcohol markers in this case, but really you could use paints or really anything to colour that in with green. We want to cover both sides. I'm just letting this be as random as I need and coating it with a couple of different greens to give us a little bit more variation as we go. Then cutting out some strips. I then cut down the toothpicks to a more reasonable size to fit with our minis, coated them with some super glue and started adding on those strips of green paper. This was very fiddly work. I covered my hands in more super glue than pretty much any other build that I've done in a long time, but ultimately I was really happy with how this looked. Once we had enough random strips stuck to it, we could bend out the tops and cut them into a more triangular cut off, giving us that effect of a really nice leafy husk that you get from a corn stalk. I loved the result of this style of build, but it was really fiddly and took a while. So I then tried cutting off a kind of more just random shapes and sharp edges, gluing them onto our main stick and just wrapping it around, having them get further and further down as it went. Ultimately, this led to a much messier and thicker stalk, but honestly, it really did the trick, especially if you're going to be making a heap of these. This is probably a quicker way to approach it, giving you a decent result in a much smaller amount of time. But as you can see with the comparison, the individual strips look a lot better. Now, it was getting late and I couldn't be bothered making an entire garden bed just of the corn stalks. So I decided to add them onto our tomatoes batch. For this, I put a few holes in the ground, added a tiny little bit of super glue, probably a bad idea because this melted a little bit of the foam underneath, but hey, what are you going to do? And just stuck all of our corn stalks in place, leaving us with a bit more of a random mixed veggie patch, but hey, it's going to serve its purpose, and let's be honest, a lot of us do mixed veggie patches, so it'll work for the game table. Looking at this now in the edit, I kind of wish I'd done a second row of corn to really thicken that up, but maybe I'll come back to that later.
These are all looking great, but we have one more spare bed left, and for that I'm going back to the 3D printer.
I scaled down a heap of these cabbages and lettuces that I found on Thingiverse for free, the link's going to be in the description if you want them yourself, and printed them out before gluing them down in strips. A couple of rows of lettuces, a row of cabbages, and then grabbing out a speed paint to just give them a decent bit of colour. Honestly, this was the easiest of all of the garden beds. Obviously you need a 3D printer for this one, so it's not accessible to everyone, but they look great, they're easy enough to do, and these models are free. So with a basic print, prime, and a speed paint, you've got some really nice, beautiful visual garden beds ready to throw down in any farm environment on your table. To finish out these final rows, I didn't have any more 3D prints and I didn't want to build anything else from scratch, so I just stuck down a few bits of grass tufts and flowers to do our last couple of rows of some kinds of herbs or plants to fill in this garden bed. Essentially, by making them all in these perfect strips, you could say just about anything is a flowering, fruiting, or edible plant. This is obviously the easiest of all of my garden beds to build, but honestly, I don't find it as fun when I'm not building everything from scratch. But with that, we are left with a full collection of different veggie patch scatter pieces that we can throw down on any battle board, game table, or really any situation in a tabletop game.
I am really stoked with how all of these have come out. They're giving me a nice variety of different bits of scatter that I can throw down, and due to the fact that I've made them in their trellis systems and a bit more different to just normal bits of grass and flowers, it really does give them the vibe of fruiting or vegetable plants, which is fun to have down the table because we don't see a lot of it. There's a lot of grass tufts and flowers out there that are really easy to access, but I just don't think we see enough actual growing fruit and veggies, which, let's be honest, in these fantasy vibes is going to be something that basically every single building would have. With all of these builds being something you can actually make without needing to go out and buy a whole heap of stuff, I think they're going to be able to be a really cool addition to most tabletop games. Whether you're playing Warhammer and you want some kind of cover or just something to make the table look more interesting, or a D&D campaign where you're traveling around and exploring different environments, these would find a place in just about every farm, village, or township that you encounter on a fantasy game. And if you're wondering what inspired this build, here's a little tease. We have hobbit holes coming. Oh, I'm also working on some fruiting trees, so expect some kind of orchard video soon. I hope you guys have enjoyed this video. I'm gonna probably be getting a bit more loose with my production going forward, as I really just haven't had the time to build out as much as I would like, and I want to make heaps of the ideas that are running around in my head. Let me know if there's anything you'd like to see me build, and let me know if you've got any questions, because I'll be doing an FAQ video soon, hopefully answering most of the questions that I get a lot, and if you've got anything specific you'd like to ask me. And until next time, never stop making stuff.
If you want some more gardens that are more modular and reusable, check out this video here, and if you're interested in seeing my work in progress shots for things coming out in the future, I'm now on Patreon.